The following is a conversation with Nirmal Mehta. Nirmal graduated with an electrical engineering degree, but his true calling was information technology. He is a Docker captain and currently a principal solutions architect at AWS. Unlike pen and paper engineers and architects, Nirmal has implemented high profile applications in production. His interests range from open source, machine learning, robotics, to Docker Kubernetes. Now, somehow miraculously, I am humbled to call him a coworker and friend. In today's chat, we will ask Nirmal some of the questions my followers asked, such as how to contribute to open source, what topics to master to get a Kubernetes DevOps job, real world challenges, and more. Nirmal, can you please introduce yourself?
Absolutely, Raj. I'm Nirmal Mehta. I'm a principal solution architect in the containers specialty with AWS. And I am super happy to be here and have an awesome conversation with you, Raj. I'm a deep technologist, an emerging technology explorer. I have 13 years of public sector, US government public sector consulting and contracting experience, and rode all the different waves for the last 13 years: cloud, DevOps, containerization, distributed application architectures, and a little sprinkle of augmented reality and virtual reality in my career as well. So I hope we get into all kinds of topics today, and I'm super excited to be here. Thank you, Raj.
Excellent. You are a Kubernetes expert. I get this question a lot. Kubernetes is a huge area. How can a newcomer learn Kubernetes? What topics should they start with, and how should they progress?
That's a really good question, and I understand why someone would want to ask that question. The landscape is massive. I'm sure some of the folks that listen to your show, Raj, and yourself have seen the latest CNCF landscape. They put out this landscape of all the different open source projects and proprietary commercial companies that are involved in that space. And every year it grows, bigger and bigger. And it's really hard to understand, like, where to even approach this complex beast of a topic. So, first off, as a newcomer, how to learn Kates or Kubernetes, you want to start locally. You want to start locally on your machine, right? So if you've got a decent laptop and you can get Docker Desktop installed on there, that's a great way to get started with not only a Docker environment native to the operating system that you're used to for your daily work and daily learning, but then you can also spin up a Kubernetes cluster locally through Docker Desktop. And what that will allow you to do is a very low risk, low cost, or zero cost environment to kick the tires. That it's not perfect. It's not exactly what you would see maybe on EKS or if you're doing like a managed or self-managed Kubernetes installation, but it's enough to understand the API and to get started. And then with that, you can also use something on other areas, like play with K8s.
Yep. I'll give the link.
Yeah, we'll put the link on. And that's like in browser Kubernetes environment with lessons, right? Mm-hmm. On top of that, find your favorite Udemy or Pluralsight education places for a course and just go through the basics of Kubernetes. But I would make sure that you use a local environment first, and that really helps you understand the API, get something up and running pretty quickly. But also, Kubernetes is not in a void by itself. You're going to be building containers to run in that environment. Mm-hmm. So you're going to have an environment to build your application containers or have images. And that's going to be part and parcel with something like Docker Desktop. Then once you get into that, with respect to the second question you had, which is, how do you progress from there, right? So you have to start with a containers understanding. I mean, that's the foundational element that we're orchestrating with the container orchestration platform like Kubernetes. So you got to understand what containers are. Once you do that, you investigate the Kubernetes control plane. What are the actual components? It, you know, and Raj, you've been working with Kubernetes for a little bit now too. It always seems like a really complex mystery of what's going on to provide this kind of very complex declarative reconciliation looping thing, right? API that does all kinds of stuff in the back end. But when you really dig into the control plane, you'll realize it's pretty straightforward. There's just a handful of components that are put together that provide the baseline API. And understanding that helps you understand and resolve the mystery, right? Remove the curtain there, if you will, of what actually Kubernetes is doing, so that when you're progressing through the rest of the things I'm going to mention, you can tie it back to, okay, where is this next thing? What's happening within the control plane to make that work? And really understanding the reconciliation loop nature of the API, because that's probably the most powerful part of Kubernetes is this kind of architectural API pattern of reconciling and having controllers for resources. And the system is figuring out how to make the environment match what you're asking it to do. And how does it do that, right? So then from there, you understand the control plane and the components of Kubernetes. You go to cluster creation, and then you go to creating pods, right? So cluster creation doesn't have to be production ready or highly available. That can be left for another lesson, another time. But just understanding the different components that need to be up for a basic cluster to be stood up. I would do that either on like something with Docker Desktop with different tools like Kind or others, or if you have some resources like even some Raspberry Pis or some virtual machines somewhere, you can set up a cluster pretty quickly. Typically between 1 to 3 nodes. If you use something like Minikube, you can do it all in one. And then once you go from there, you start creating your first pods, right? So the pod, again, just like a container is a foundational element to all of this, pod collection of containers is the base unit for anything in the Kubernetes world. Right. And so creating your first pod allows you to understand what's going on there, what all the steps are that Kubernetes needs to take to get that pod up and running, all the different components that talk to each other for that. And then you build from there. Service discovery, how you get 2 pods talking to each other, how do they find each other? Network ingress, how do you get traffic in and out of your pod? Replica sets, how do you make sure you have more than one of those pods across a fleet of nodes in your Kubernetes cluster? Deployments, how are you specifying more advanced features of how you want your pod or application to be deployed? Daemon sets, how do you ensure that you have backend services that are needed on every single node in your cluster to provide additional services to your application? And then from there, you'll start to hit onto, once you get to more advanced topics, you're going to start to hit on config maps and secrets, right? So that's storing information that is relevant to that application in that specific environment. And secrets is super important for any kind of real world application you're going to be doing. And then from there, you go into the more advanced topics, which are, in my mind, the RBAC, the role-based access control of the Kubernetes API, and overall of Kubernetes, because that's how you start to get into security and understanding the fine-grained nature of that. And then if you're very masochistic and you want to go through some pain, you can do stateful sets and understanding how to do stateful services on Kubernetes. And then you go into building out a real world app, like the robot shop example we talked about briefly earlier. That's like a great microservices application that you can take. Don't take any of the YAML that they provide and just create your own YAML for that application and see how you can get a 10 microservices application talking with each other with different data services. So if you do that, that's the progression. That's a very quick overcap or review of a progression there, but that gets you the basics, and it is complex. I mean,
cool. How did you learn Kubernetes, Nirmal?
Painfully. So, and I'm not really sure how useful my anecdote and my story around this is going to be to all of you that are listening to this. I was very lucky in my career to hit upon these technologies really early on the onset of them. So I was already playing around with Docker and involved in the Docker community before Kubernetes was a thing, right? Before it was announced. So um, how did I learn Kubernetes? Because I was a big proponent of Docker Swarm,
Mm-hmm.
and I needed to understand Kubernetes because there's a comparison there and there's an engineering trade-off there that I needed to understand. So in my previous roles, I was, a solution architect, a system architect, and you have to make decisions on what kind of container orchestration platform you want to use. And you, you have to learn all of them to understand what the trade-offs are, right? So I learned it through uh, just like anyone else, like downloading the bits and installing it and going through the getting started tutorials and all the pain of getting all that stuff up and running and etcd and all that stuff, and then realized that it's way too complicated for a lot of the customers I was supporting at that time, and switched, recommended Docker Swarm at that time because of what Kubernetes was trying to do, and the operator kind of first approach to it versus a developer first approach to container orchestration, right? So that was my journey in terms of learning Kubernetes. It's the same journey that I have with any other technology that I have to learn, which
Yeah.
is I need to learn this to do the thing I need to do, right? So um, I believe we've had a conversation in the past, like about motivation, right? And how do you find motivation to learn something? I find in talking with lots of other people, and I'm still exploring this for myself, even though it seems like from the outside that, I learn very quickly. It's not necessarily the case that I feel motivated to learn a specific topic, but if I give myself a deadline
Mm-hmm.
or something in the future that I need to meet that requires me to learn this thing, then I'm going to learn it, or I'm going to fail trying. But even fail trying means I learned something, right?
Yeah.
And converting unknown unknowns to known unknowns is always a part of that process, and never stops, right? So the short answer is painfully, because I had to for my job, and also because I have inherent curiosity around all this stuff, right?
Yes. I mean, you learn Kubernetes the hard way, right? Today, if someone is picking up Kubernetes, they don't necessarily need to know how etcd algorithm works.
Yeah.
How
Yeah, there were no like Udemy courses until later, right? Kubernetes is a lot better than it was on its onset, right? It's still tricky to run a highly available, production ready, scalable control plane in Kubernetes, and that's why there are cloud services like EKS that provide value, right? So I do recommend, like, if you have the stomach for it, I would recommend like Kelsey Hightower's Kubernetes the hard way. There's an AWS version I believe someone made as well, and I think, if you're aiming to get more deeper into this world and become a real subject matter expert around Kubernetes, I would highly recommend doing that, because it forces you to really deeply understand the API and the components and how they fit together. And then at the same time, you start to realize why Kubernetes is valuable for whatever the use case is, right? So, and why, when it's not going to be valuable, right? So like, and I know we might get to this later in this conversation around like the use cases for against Kubernetes in an architecture, but that's an important way of approaching it, is to deeply understand it, right? So I think there's a lot of confusion in the industry with respect to Kubernetes being like a buzzword, because folks don't necessarily understand the actual intent of what Kubernetes is trying to do versus whatever vendor is promising that Kubernetes will deliver for your specific problem, right? So
I mean,
there's a difference there.
Another question folks have in their mind is, how much Docker should someone know when they're learning Kubernetes?
I would say that you need at least a 200 level understanding of Docker and containers. Ideally, the more that you understand of Docker and containers in general, the better you're going to understand what Kubernetes is providing you versus the promises that maybe you read somewhere around what Kubernetes is doing, right? So um, they go hand in hand. So you have to understand how to get your app containerized, and you have to understand what the container runtime is doing, because Docker, uh, Docker Engine or Container D, which is where the industry is going, uh, is a core part of Kubernetes, right? It's like you still have a Docker or container runtime as part of your Kubernetes structure, and you need to know what it's doing, right? Because at the end of the day, your containerized app is running through a Docker engine,
Right.
and that Docker engine is being controlled by Kubernetes, right? So you have to understand what it's doing and how it's being run and the configuration of it to a certain extent before you start to scale it out with something like Kubernetes, right? That relationship between the container, right? So building a container, creating a Docker file, understanding, how to specify what you want to have happen inside the container, what it's pre-boot, post-boot, entry point, all of that is super important, because there's another interface through the Kubernetes deployment YAML or manifests or other manifests that you're going to be specifying those options, and those directly map eventually to what Docker is doing for your container. So
actually, we always rave about Kubernetes, so I'm gonna jump into the question, like, what are some of the cases you think Kubernetes is not good for? And you can give couple. I will jump in as well.
yeah, I mean, I would love to hear your use cases as well. I mean, there's definitely some rough edges with respect to the learning curve, I guess, or the expectations with respect to your application architecture that align with Kubernetes or don't align, right? So if you've got some really big monolithic Java applications and like 60 gig Docker images for like your big JBoss, or I don't want to pick on JBoss, but some Java middleware kind of application. Do you want to just like start with Kubernetes with that? Probably not, right? Like you could, and there's nothing really inherently wrong, like, or inherently going to stop you from that, but it's not the pattern that Kubernetes is trying to solve for you. Kubernetes is really good. It was developed with more of an operator mindset, right? It's coming from that viewpoint. So think of it as an API to operate massive infrastructure, right? Large scale things. And so the smaller your thing is, the more heavyweight Kubernetes can feel. That story is changing better and better every year as time goes on, but there's a trade-off there in terms of time and complexity and the issues. So, or the issues that Kubernetes is solving, those might not be issues for your specific use case, right? So if just running a couple of containers on one EC2 instance, for example, is all you need to do, then take a look at serverless, or take a look at ECS, or take a look at just running a Docker engine on a host and running that, like that's fine, or it's not, right? Like, so like another thing is like the Windows story is it's a little bit behind the regular Kubernetes world.
It's getting better, but yes,
it's getting better. So if you've got like you've got like a hardcore, I don't know, unlinuxable .NET core, like .NET coreable,
yes,
if I can make that term, like application, and you need like very specific Windows API support or something like that, you're probably going to hit a lot of walls with respect to Kubernetes at some point. So, you want to think really deeply about what you're trying to accomplish, because on the flip side, putting it like, if you know that you're going to be starting at something that might not be conducive to Kubernetes, but you want to end up in something that is maybe something that is more conducive, or that Kubernetes provides a better API or experience for you,
Hmm.
maybe that that initial pain is worthwhile to get that stuff running
Hmm.
and working in the environment. But that's going to be a case by case basis. Raj, what's your answer to this kind of question? I would love to know some of
Yeah, I
the
mean,
decision tree there.
so basically, Kubernetes has a lot of things going on, and there are different ways to run a container. So if you do want to containerize your app, and if your app is just, let's say, I'm just simplifying it, it just needs to call an API, go to a database, right there, and you have no idea about Kubernetes. Look at ECS, or even running on EC2 or Lambda. Definitely, number one. Number two is, I think running storage like a database or MQ, that kind of service in Kubernetes is like super high overhead. And to my mind, it's like anti-pattern. Like if you are already running in cloud, let's say you're running on EKS, hopefully, right? And now you are installing IBM MQ on that EKS cluster or some sort of database. In my mind, just to use the managed service, either ActiveMQ or the Amazon's database. And this is, yeah, we both work for AWS, but even if you are running your Kubernetes cluster in other clouds, I would say use the managed services. Um, and also, like, these days, I try to divide any use case in different areas. When I talk to a customer, I want to think about what's the scalability requirement? What's the security requirement? What's the high availability requirement, right? What's the cost requirement? So depending on that, you should pick and choose. I mean, the thing is, Kubernetes is super hot right now, and everyone wants to do Kubernetes. Sometimes it's not the ideal solution, but I sometimes have meetings where they just want to run a small batch process, right, which runs super fast, or a simple CRUD API. But they want to do Kubernetes because they think it's like a hot, and they will get to do Kubernetes and their value will go up, which is true. But yeah, you look at AWS batch, or even look at Lambda, or even running something on small EC2 at that point, right? Because Kubernetes, the power of Kubernetes is flexibility. But then the trade-off is this huge CNCF landscape. For example, okay, you want to scale your Kubernetes pods. Well, you have to install metric server, you have to know HPA, you have to know cluster autoscaler, Carpenter, all that stuff. Whereas if you're running EC2 or Lambda, it just scales. High availability, same thing. You need to learn tents and tolerations, right? Some services give that out of the box. But again, some projects, they're amazing to run on Kubernetes.
Yeah.
Both have
I don't want to discount the community, right? So
yes,
there is a value to adopting a trend because you're not alone, right? So there are some, let's say, competitive and container orchestration platforms out there, right? And you know, if they've got a very small set of users,
right,
then when you hit problems in these complex systems, you're going to be kind of alone, right? So there is an advantage to potentially being in the Kubernetes landscape because there is a lot of momentum there is a lot of tooling, but you have to understand that the fundamental API of Kubernetes is probably not going to be massively changing for specific simplicity's sake anytime soon. You have to kind of buy into that, and then you can maybe get you can get the benefits of all this other tooling that's kind of created around it. But I mean, that's up to you and that specific project, right? If you want to learn Kubernetes, then learn Kubernetes, but that doesn't necessarily mean that's like the right project for like a real business case or a business use case.
Actually, I want to dive into something different. Nirmal, we have been talking about technology, and we chat about this a lot. Technology is good, but you also have to learn some of the other skill when you are designing or being successful in IT, right? We are talking about empathy and some of the other skills. So do you want to touch upon on that? I found that viewpoint very intriguing and exciting.
Yeah. So, in the real world, the real world's a lot different than the environment that you're like learning your technologies in, right? So I'm not saying that those things aren't important. Like understanding all the things we just talked about for the last 30 minutes is important, right? So it's, you know, understanding the technologies, understanding the landscape, getting your hands dirty and breaking things and building things and understanding the APIs and containers and orchestration and ports and whatever, right? Super important. But that's only, let's say, X percentage of the story, 50% of the story. I'm just making arbitrary, right? The other part of the real world is just not, it's not clean cut, right? So in the real world, you have things like budgets and time constraints and stakeholders and egos and politics and security and compliance and, oh man, like all the things, and vendor relationships and licenses and contracts and commitments and lawyers, right? And things like that. And you can't, like, you would like to ignore all those things, right? Like our jobs would be like infinitely easier if we could ignore all those things and just focus on the technology and the solution, because that's already pretty difficult to do, right? Like let's not kid ourselves. For anything moderately complex within the enterprise, yes, you can get a lot more done with simpler technologies now than ever before, but at the same time, that just causes more like you end up doing more, which turns into more complexity, right? So that's already a tough thing to do. Then you add all that, all the things I just mentioned on top of that. That's like, you can't just skip all that, right? That's deeply embedded into all the things that you have to decide. And one of the mistakes I see a lot of new people in the IT industry or tangential industries within IT is that they underestimate how much of those things actually impact the technology decisions or the engineering trade-offs. And so if there's one area that I would love to like communicate to your audience and to you, the person that is listening to this video, is that you have to work on not only keeping your technology smarts sharp, but you also should work on having and creating a deeper understanding of the stakeholders that are part of whatever you're working on, their incentives, right? What's driving the decisions that they're trying to make or driving what they want or the outcomes that they want. You have to understand the business drivers, right? What's the context of your customers' business needs? What's their business model? I'm sure you've seen in a lot of your customer conversations where deep technology decisions that they're trying to navigate have really big implications in terms of their business model, right? It could be the difference between, positive margins and negative margins, or, making money or not making money. And we'd love to ignore that part if we could, but we can't, right? And choosing Kubernetes, like we just had this big discussion about when to choose Kubernetes or not. That's a real decision. And that's a one-way door, if you will, for some organizations, right? And not easy to reverse, and means a commitment of a specific amount of time, and it's not just willy-nilly, right? And okay, Nirmal, you saying you need to do deeper understanding of all these things, and like the culture and the people and the hard part, the humans in the equation. How do you do that, right? So in Kubernetes world, I have tools like Raj in the cloud and Udemy and Docker desktop and like Raspberry Pis and things like that in my laptop. Empathy is your tool. I'm suggesting to you that empathy can be one of your tools to start to dig into that on better understanding of the stakeholders and the incentives. And what is empathy, right? So empathy is like you understanding another person's worldview, right? What they're going through, their incentives, their drivers, their goals, their day-to-day. And having the ability to empathize and dig into your customers or the people that you're working with or the stakeholders, and really understanding what's motivating them will profoundly change how you approach engineering problems and your day-to-day job as a cloud solution architect or any of the other roles within IT and around its orbit, right? And that's that tool of empathy and active listening and engaging and really listening and understanding those stakeholders will create massive benefits, not only in your professional career, but also pretty much any other part of your life. And what you can do with that is then you can start to make sure that you're aligning the incentives, or you're aligning what you're doing to to incentivize or the incentives that your stakeholders have, right? So everyone has to learn how to sell something at some point. And selling also means having to understand how to create a story around whatever you're trying to sell, right? So right now I'm trying to sell you on making empathy your North Star for deeply understanding, your stakeholders.
Yeah.
And the way I'm going to do that is I'm going to give you an anecdote, right? Which is a great storytelling device. I'm doing a little loop here. So an anecdote I had, I was with a customer. This is in my previous role at my previous company. And we were transitioning them from desktop computers to laptops. And Raj, does that sound like a very complicated thing where you would get any kind of resistance to that from your workforce? No, that doesn't sound complicated. Well, we were having a massively hard time, and a lot of resistance convincing these employees to take these laptops and get rid of their desktops, right? And so, it was a real head scratcher because there was like lots of devs and others that are like, great, I finally get a nice laptop, I get better hardware, like all that jazz, right? I can work at different places. And then there was like this core contingent of people that were just pushing back. And so I realized that there's something missing here, right? So this thing that seems super simple. All right. So I exercise my empathy, right? So I grabbed some time on some of these folks' calendar, and through just a hour long conversation, I get to kind of just understand, hey, how do you use your desktop right now? Is it a power thing, like in terms of CPU or RAM or whatever, right? Is it like a technology thing? No, the laptops were more powerful. They had better GPUs, things like that. Okay. Take me through your day to day, right? Okay. I come to the office, I log in, I go to lunch and I'm away from my computer and I come back. Right. Okay. Doesn't seem like there's a problem there with a laptop being instead of a desktop. Then we started digging into it. Okay. Like what's your fear with respect to having a laptop? This seems so simple, right, Raj? Like, Raj, you're like, where's this even going? All right. So this little group of people that were stalling this whole entire process, they were concerned that once they get laptops, management and everyone else will start requiring them to take it home and work after hours and on call or, over the weekend, late at night. And so they saw me bringing laptops in, not me, like me personally, right? Because I was the one handling this project. They saw that as a threat to like their whole entire life.
Right.
Right. Right. And like this was just like such a big fear. And so we made it a policy that you had to get an exception to take it home, right? So like they weren't forced to take it home, right? And we communicated to management like, you don't, we turn off Outlook at 6:00 every day or something, like things like that, or weekends. And then they were perfectly fine with it, right? And so it's like that's like an anecdote and a way of showing you how powerful empathy is, and also like technology solutions are relatively easy to these problems because those fears that we have, and everyone's got them about all kinds of stuff, and and unfortunately that's typically the first reaction you get from anyone. I mean, I'm guilty of it. I'm sure you're guilty of it too.
Yeah.
When I first heard of Kubernetes, I'm positive I said, I don't want that.
Yeah.
It's too complex, and I'm probably still right about that. But like, I was very resistant to it.
Yeah.
And I had a lot of, not fear necessarily, but it wasn't something that I naturally should have been so resistant to, right? I should have been a little bit more open to it. But that's humans, right? That's like everyone.
Definitely.
And so using empathy as your tool to really understand the stakeholders, their fears, their
Mhm.
incentives, what they're worried about. I mean, I've had customers where, the success of this project meant a promotion,
Yeah.
or just showing that something was successful meant a promotion,
Yeah.
right? And there's other projects where they didn't want to seem like anything was going well, because
Yeah.
that meant a promotion,
Yeah.
right? And so like, like
Agreed.
that we're messy, emotional, bags of water, and we have to deal with that. So that's one thing that I want to communicate with respect
Mhm.
to uh, what they don't teach you in school necessarily, and maybe they've started doing that.
But it's very funny that you mentioned, because after I went through all my theoretical study, right? Okay, I'm like, okay, I know CAP theorem, like the consistency, availability,
Yeah,
partition. So if depending on use case, we should prioritize C or A or P, and we should
yeah.
change our databases accordingly. And then when I joined the actual IT industry, they're like, what? No, we're not gonna learn new databases for each use case. Oracle it is for everything, right? So these things come into play because
All the time.
all the time. Another example is when you are studying something, you think a lot about what's the right architecture. Okay, based on all this is the best architecture you can have. But then when you
Right.
work in real world, it doesn't matter. The team doesn't want to learn that thing, right? Maybe Kubernetes is the ideal architecture, and they're like, no, we don't want to learn Kubernetes. And that similarly, like maybe DynamoDB is a good example, could be a great use case. But then they're like, no, we have license, and we paid for this license for this
Yeah.
particular database, and we are going to keep using it. Why should I go DynamoDB?
Yeah. So, I mean, at the same time, there's no such thing as a perfect abstraction or a perfect solution, right?
Correct. Yes.
That
Yes.
never exists. I think, that's another big thing that new people kind of hit the wall on, is that
Right.
when you're in a very controlled environment learning this
Yep.
stuff,
Mm-hmm.
there things are kind of perfect in that sense.
Right.
But everything when it comes to IT and engineering is a trade-off. If you can't tell your stakeholders what the trade-off is
Right.
and communicate that, because A, you don't think there's a trade-off, or B, you haven't identified it,
Yeah.
you're missing something.
Mhm.
That's a very good red flag, or a tell, where if I have someone pitching me an architecture or a new
Yeah.
solution, if they can't communicate the trade-off that's happening,
Mhm.
the pros and cons, then something is off. That's like a massive red flag in my mind, that, okay, go back and find out, like the cap there,
Yeah.
and you can't have all these things, right? You can't, like, if you're doing disaster recovery, you can't move bits faster than the speed of light somewhere,
Right.
right? Like, and if you're selling me a solution where, that doesn't make sense anymore, right, where physics is being broken,
Yeah.
then you haven't communicated the trade-off. And what that then leads to is, what did I just say there? Communicating the trade-off. Communicating is storytelling, and storytelling is selling, right? So that's what I mean by like, even if you're not a sales engineer, or an account manager or something like that, everyone is selling all the time, whether you want to or not.
Exactly.
In your team, you're selling your solution, you're
Mhm.
selling the work you're doing.
Yep.
And for small things, you don't have to create a story for that, but you have to get better at
Yeah.
making sure that you can communicate a story around that, because that's how we make decisions, especially in places that move fast and are driven by consensus and et cetera. Like, communicating and having an opinion, and being able to back that opinion up with data or analysis, and communicating that in an effective way with the minimum amount of air movement, or words, or in a simple way, is probably one of the most one of the best skills someone can someone can create in themselves or learn over time in their career.
No, definitely. No, that's really good point, Nirmal. So talking about all this learning, so what is the next big idea and project that you are like to dive in, time permitting, of course?
Yeah, so all kinds of stuff. So there's observability and tracing. I'll actually put this in a broader bucket of the developer experience with respect to Kubernetes. And containers is ever evolving, and I don't think it's quite great. and I'd like to see a tighter loop, right? So when you're a software developer, the flexibility you get from the tight iteration loop, right? So creating code, running it, debugging it, that loop, or I'll put it this way in the camera, that loop, the tighter that loop is, the more efficient you're going to be as a software developer. And one of the really, really rough edges with respect to container orchestration and these things like Kubernetes is, once your application's in that world, you can't just like easily mock all those services back locally, right? And so that loop becomes a little bit longer. And so shortening that loop within Kubernetes is an area of interest for me. I think there's a lot of area to explore there and to get better, things like distributed tracing, or focusing on languages that have debug runtime ability within that programming language's runtime, right? And this is another area that I haven't really dug into, is developing on Kubernetes, right? So your development environment is like a pod or something running inside a cluster. What does that look like? How do we
Can we run Cloud9 in Kubernetes? That would be
well, I mean, that's like, so all the permutations to kind of to tighten that loop is going to be beneficial, and to mock out the other services, right? So that's one area. Another big one is trusted software supply chain. So this is a big concept or a very popular concept that's coming up in the industry right now because of major hacks and big vulnerabilities that have happened in the last year or two. And this is around creating a provenance, an auditable, governed provenance trail for the software that's being run somewhere, right? So tracing the line of code and who wrote that line of code all the way to where it's running, and making sure that hasn't changed along the way, right? So it doesn't take much searching on the internet to find some massive examples in the last year around where something like this could have helped, maybe not prevent it, but at least reduce the blast radius a little bit. And so how does Kubernetes fit into that? How does image signing fit into that? How does strengthening our CI/CD pipelines and doing some cryptography across there, creating some policies on the Kubernetes and control plane or on the nodes to lock down where things are coming from, and making sure that they say they are what they are, right? Is super interesting to me. And then another area I would say is like the different types of compute that we have now, right? So we have Mac, M1 chips, we have GPUs, we have ARM, Graviton, right? Windows. I said it again, Windows containers. Gotta put a little tip jar somewhere, right? I don't want to mention that again. But that's like the being able to take advantage of different compute and using that as an identifier for the workload, things like Fargate and Carpenter, and really elevating Kubernetes to what it was meant, what it was built for, right? So some folks have the idea that Kubernetes is actually like an operating system for the cloud, right? So you have this like API that's meant for platform building and for resource scheduling. So how do you take advantage of that in different ways, right? Once you start to build applications that take advantage of Kubernetes at a more basic level, then you can start to do more advanced things on top of that. So that's an area of exploration. There's all the K8 SIGs, right? The special intergroups that are working on like things like multi-cluster and multi-tenancy and namespace hierarchy and things like that. So that's within the Kubernetes world. I mean, maybe we'll save
You
this
will
for
be
another.
busy, Nirmal,
Yeah,
this year.
let's save this topic for another. I hope you invite me back again, Raj. And so
Definitely.
let's save this topic for another discussion, because there's like an infinite amount of things that I want to explore in this space, and I feel like I'm just getting started.
Next question, Nirmal. You contributed to open source. How can someone contribute to open source? Like where to start from? What are the prerequisites? And how would they even find the projects to contribute on?
Yeah, contributing to open source. That's like a perennial topic, right?
Yep.
I want to show that I'm part of a community. I want to show that I know this technology. I get my name out there, get hired at a company, right? So first of all, pick a nice community, right? So pick a place that has a passionate, welcoming environment to contribute to, right? So contrary to others' advice, maybe is maybe not picking the really big things, or if you are, picking smaller components of really big things, right? If it's a really big community that's used by lots of large corporations, yes, people are going to be nice, and there's like established governance necessarily, for sure, but it's also like there could be really contentious things that are happening in those communities. So just be aware of that. I would say Kubernetes is actually a really good place to start. And I would say I would stretch it to any of the CNCF projects, are probably a good place to start. There's tons of them. The nice thing about the Kubernetes and CNCF in general is that there's a really well-defined, transparent governance model working over these communities, right? And that means that there are defined ways of contributing and getting involved, and there are patterns there. There are getting started guides, and there are, just at a base level, there are meetings and meetups and things that you can just join, right? So I would recommend things like the Docker community or CNCF communities or Kubernetes. Special interest groups are open to all. And okay, great. You found a community. Well, I don't know Golang. I'm not going to just like patch bomb this like, PR into there. Like, that's not going to work, right? So like any relationship, there's no shortcut here. You have to put the time in, right? There's no, and I can almost feel your audience saying, well, I just want to like contribute to open source so I can get that line on my resume.
Yeah.
No, like this is a relationship, right? So if you pick something that you're actually going to feel like you're going to be passionate about, right? For at least, let's just say, a minimum of time of a year, right? And so where to start within that? I highly recommend always starting with the docs. The reason is, if you're new to that technology, you're probably going to be reading the docs anyway. And if there's corrections or updates or things in there, you're already there looking at that content. Contribute there.
That's a great
that will there's always need for doc stuff. For every open source project ever created by man, by people kind, right? By people. And the docs are the largest surface area for an open source community, right? That's where all the new people are. That's where all the experienced people are. So there's a lot of visibility there, and a lot of people that don't touch the docs in terms of like contributing to them. So the docs always need to be updated. There's always missing things. And if you're learning that thing, you're the perfect person to be contributing new content for that, or updating it, or fixing typos or whatever. I'm not a Golang person. I'm not a developer in that, like, my chops are not that great. But yet I said I was part of the Docker community. Well, I was part of the Docker community because I contributed docs and events and presentations, and and teaching people this stuff
Mm-hmm.
and doing meetups, right? So I was involved in the community, but probably not in the way that you thought I was involved, right? Like I wasn't sending pull requests all the time and
Mm-hmm.
adding new features. I was doing all the other stuff around that, right? And that's a great place to get involved because you'll meet the people that matter. You'll understand the topics that are of interest, and if you are a software developer, then you'll understand where those pain points are and that people are trying to accomplish within there. And that's where you're going to start to figure out, okay, what does a pull request look like? Because for these CNCF things, those are not just like quick hits that you can do like an internal GitHub kind of thing. Like
Mm-hmm.
you have to agree to give up this, your property, your copyright to the project, and they have to pass tests and things like that. So that's another area to get involved with, is the testing frameworks for these things. And I'm
Mm-hmm.
not talking about the testing framework for Kubernetes itself. That's probably very well established, but like the side projects, right? The SIGs, the special interest groups, open telemetry, right? There's like tons of stuff there,
Yeah.
right? So docs and tests all day long.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And creating content, right? Like creating content, videos, small things, right, around specific features or how to get started, or explaining how things work.
Right.
That is always super valuable, and gets you into that community.
Yeah, and also if you're looking for like quick hits, you can look at AWS's repositories. Like AWS has these GitHub repos
Yeah.
of quick start and solutions, and we are always looking for enhancements. You don't even
Yes.
have to find out what to change. Like we have an airline reservation system. We are looking for someone to integrate some mock payment APIs. And if you know how to do Swagger and stuff, jump in. Similarly,
Yeah.
browse all the quick starts, and you could say on your resume, like, okay, you contributed to AWS. But you do have to learn how the GitHub process works, though. Like
Yeah. And I mean, but that's
that's
the
you have
work,
to do
right?
anyway. You have to do
Yeah. Like
yeah.
if you start with the sentence, I want to contribute to open source, that's what that means,
That's what
is
that
learning all that, right?
exactly.
And it's not hard. Like once you see it, and and there's all these communities, the big ones are very open and
Mm-hmm.
relatively safe spaces,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I would say. The other thing there is, and you reminded me, is I think most of the AWS docs and like the getting started guide for EKS, those are all open source
All
too,
open
right?
source.
There's
Yep.
just communities where it's only docs,
Yeah.
right? And
Yeah.
so like
Yeah.
create
We do
content
PRs
there.
all the time, and whoever's PR gets merged, they get the credit.
Yeah.
It stays
Yep.
in their GitHub profile.
Yep.
You
And
could
like
use that
EKS
as well.
workshop is open, and
Yeah.
that always needs help.
Always, always.
So
All right, couple more questions, Nirmal. This one
man,
is
lots of questions. Lots of
a
questions.
lot of questions. Well, we got expert. We gotta, we gotta dig in your mind. We gotta go through the
Uh,
inception so that other folks can follow how you became a principal architect, right?
yeah.
Um,
Yep.
Imagine someone is already in Kubernetes. What are a couple of the big things that coming down the pike, or latest best practices that you think folks should start learning right now?
Yeah, I haven't watched all of your videos,
Mhm.
Raj. I apologize.
That's
Big
okay. We
fan,
forgive
but
you.
I haven't watched all of them.
Yeah,
So you've probably done a session around something like GitOps, right? And
absolutely.
so
Mhm.
I'm just gonna say GitOps is still super relevant. It's
Yeah.
it's still like evolving.
I think it's gonna
It's
take over the CD. Actually, it's funny. I have one of my videos which is doing pretty well, where I
mhm,
show how to do the CI using Jenkins, tag the image, and then GitOps using Argo CD. We deploy it, right? And
right.
I predict that because of the customer meetings I'm having these days, everyone is talking about it, and this is how a trend starts, folks. I mean,
Yeah,
you start going to this meeting and you keep hearing this thing like that.
yeah,
That's how like Graviton started, or that's how like DynamoDB started. And I could see it in all my DevOps meeting. They want to talk about GitOps. So I'm pretty confident in like almost all big organization, the CD part will be on GitOps.
I think I think there's still a lot of refinement that needs to be done in the GitOps pattern.
Yeah.
But I think the value proposition of GitOps, especially with respect to continuous delivery
Yeah.
or deployment, is very strong
Yeah.
because it forces good habits.
Yeah.
And what I mean by good habits is infrastructure as code in a central source of truth, right? And I think the reconciliation loop and all the little other bits can be strengthened, and I think that's going to mature over time. But the overall pattern is a very strong pattern, and it feels like a natural evolution of, okay, you've done CI/CD, now you're doing containers,
Right.
now you've got like a container orchestration platform, now you've got Kubernetes,
Yeah.
now you need to get multiple things to multiple APIs. You started adopting Git for your code, your Docker file, whatever. Like it's the natural evolution of all these things, these different threads kind of intersecting for that. And I'm super looking forward to what advanced things one can start doing with when you start to adopt GitOps, right, as the CD part, because then you can start to do a little bit more advanced things when you have this kind of nice clean decoupling. And it'll be interesting to see that. And so this other pattern, it's related to GitOps in the sense that it's emerging at the same time, but they don't rely on each other for anything specific, is things like crossplane or ACK, right? And this is an evolution because people are starting to use the Kubernetes API. They're starting to make their own custom controllers and custom resource definitions. That means that there's something about the Kubernetes API that a lot of people like.
Yep.
This declarative reconciliation kind of pattern is very appealing. And now folks are starting to use that API for things that are not like necessarily Kubernetes related, if you will. And so things like ACK, or so AWS controller for Kubernetes, which you might have talked about in this show at some point in the past, or things like crossplane, where you're using the Kubernetes API or CRDs to manage the lifecycle of cloud resources or any kind of resource, is, I think, a pattern that we are going to see strong adoption continuing to go through. And there's two things about both GitOps and crossplane. You have to have a good understanding of Kubernetes to do either one of those, I think. And you shouldn't dive into those just right away. So like if you're new to Kubernetes
and you go ACK,
don't go like I do not recommend starting with crossplane or GitOps or anything like that.
Yes, I agree.
Move the timeline on this video a little bit to the previous part of this conversation and start there. But if you're working with Kubernetes, or you have an environment and you're doing it for work, and you want to kind of see some new stuff that's happening and see if these things are valuable for you. I mean, you could be running an organization that's using Jenkins, doing this stuff perfectly fine all day long. But having a central API and then a central repo for source of truth, so combining these two things is like a very powerful thing. It also reminds me of the Chef Puppet, the Chef Puppet days. We're kind of going back to that, right? What is old is new again. But it's like a different way of doing it. And I think it's a better way of doing it at this point. We're headed toward that, like not a repeat, but like a remix of that past pattern.
Funny enough, I am actually gonna try this crossplane.io this weekend. And I want to provision lambdas from Kubernetes. We don't have a native support yet. The AWS SDK for Lambda is still in progress, but we do have for S3 and stuff. But I want to try that out, so that will be interesting. So talking about learning this stuff, I want to know about your life story, Nirmal. So your last name gives away that you are Indian, but yet you are not like a traditional Indian, right? You are this mad genius. So I want to know, like, what happened? Was that like electric spark when you were a kid? How did Nirmal become Nirmal of today?
The typical way. I don't know. So You're right. My last name is Mehta, which is a traditionally an Indian name. I'm actually half Indian, half Dutch. I was born in the Netherlands, and um, a
That
proud.
explain your luscious long mane.
Yeah, you mean my luscious locks.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's my background. So one of the things I'm very proud of is being biracial, multiracial, right? And uh even though in my childhood this caused a lot of consternation,
Mm-hmm.
there was an advantage to being biracial, or at least multiracial, multicultural.
Mm-hmm.
And that was that I was never fully in a group and never fully out of a group,
Correct.
multiple groups.
Yep.
And I think that fine-tuned over time my ability to observe people
Mm-hmm.
and fine-tuned my emotional intelligence,
Mm-hmm.
my ability to like understand people
Yep.
and get to know them, because I could never really fit in a group.
Yep.
And at the same time, I felt I was like always on the outside looking in.
Mm-hmm.
And so those are skills that, through a lot of anguish and pain and teen angst and
Mm-hmm.
all the things that most people kind of go through, that was my journey that probably influenced that the most. I also had older parents, which means that I was around older people more, which lends to being a little bit more mature, I guess, as a kid, and being able to have what I would probably say is more mature conversations early on in my childhood. And those kind of combinations kind of drove a really strong empathetic and emotional intelligence within me, and ability to just listen and also talk, right? Have like conversations like we're having today,
Right.
around all kinds of topics. I have a very deep sense of curiosity,
Mm-hmm.
and I love to talk to people and get to know them and get to know their story and get to know what gets them excited. When you're in some topic, and this is like one piece of advice,
Yeah.
what if you plan on doing certifications or other things, when you're in that topic, do those things, like do
Yeah.
those
Yeah.
tests,
Mm-hmm.
because like you're never going to get back to that level. Like there was a point in my life where I was super confident about, and I knew a lot of math, right? Like in college, right? Like linear algebra, calc 3, all that stuff, right? Electromagnetics. And that was in my mind at that time.
Mm-hmm.
So I figured if I'm going to do this, I might as well try the hardest thing that I can do. And if it's too hard, then I'll just switch to something else. But like,
Right.
if I'm going to dedicate 4 years or 5 years or whatever, then I'm going to try to do the hardest thing that I can do,
Mm-hmm.
because that's going to probably be foundational to everything else. And, I had a lot of confidence in my own learning ability.
Mm-hmm.
So computer science and algorithms and all that, I can always learn that later.
Right.
But it's going to be very hard for me to understand and like be forced into the mindset of learning calc 3 when there's no real impetus for that. Right. And I'm glad I did, because and this is a gap in a lot of what I see in the industry. We've created these amazing abstractions, right? Just think about how high of an abstraction Kubernetes is
Yeah.
compared all the way down, right?
Yeah.
But the rough edges and the sharp edges and the things, sometimes those troubles, the troubleshooting, you got to go deep, and they're caused by like
Because of that
way
function.
lower things like way lower things on the stack.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not saying that like someone that wants to learn Kubernetes or DevOps needs to like understand, PNN, the different doping of like a transistor and how electrons move. And I'm not talking about that level, but have some just, shadow of an understanding of like CPU architecture and like what is actually happening. And if I were to say what's a specific place to focus on, is the performance of the different types of components of a compute place, right? So spinning disk, SSDs, RAM, caches, the CPU clock. just understand where the performance is, the network, because that's where things break down all the time.
Right. Right.
And we can paper over that like as much as we want, but the
Mhm.
cracks go deep, right? And when you have like a real, like if you're really working on cool projects or and you want to work at these big places,
Mhm.
you know, we talk to customers that are at scales that, you know, they're massive, and they, you know, they actually hit these problems, right? Where it's
Definitely.
like
Mhm.
this CPU versus this CPU does make a difference, you know? And you kind of just have to know that stuff in the back of your head just a little bit. Know that, you know, eventually you are flipping some transistors at the end of the day. It's also magic. Like it feels like magic. I deeply know how this stuff works.
Yeah.
And to me, it just seems like I don't even understand how this live stream is like
Yeah,
work,
yeah,
you
yeah.
know,
No, I know
like
the
exists.
technology.
Yeah, yeah. So the other thing I did in college was
Mhm.
I did two things. One is I took a semester not off, but I stopped, I paused all my engineering classes. And this is maybe something that was an advantage for the University of Maryland where I went to, but
Mhm.
they had different schools, right? Business school,
Right.
communications, economics. And I took a bunch of business classes and
Mhm.
economics classes and communications classes, just to see if I actually wanted to do like information technology
Mhm.
degree instead, and just to learn that stuff. I mean, I had access to that, right, in the university, and I'm glad I did, because I learned, you know, economics 101 and 102 and all
Mhm.
those, you know,
Mhm.
all the economics things and business classes and business statistics versus like
Mhm.
engineering statistics and probability is a completely different thing. Those things show up all the time in my work, right? Like it's arguable that they might even show up more than some of the technology things, and maybe that's
Yeah.
something I need to work on. But you know, back to my earlier point about we're in the real world where we have people and humans and we need to communicate, like
Yeah.
take a communications class, to, you know, do those, take a business class,
I wish,
learn.
like, like I went to college in India. I wish we had that kind of stuff in. I don't know, maybe now. I'm even older than you. So, but when I was going in
You didn't
college,
even have economics back in your day, Raj.
yeah, I mean, see that I really struggled with communication, right? Because
Yeah,
I'm a migrant. I didn't understand the accent, and I was a terrible
yeah,
presenter. So I went through Toastmasters in US. I joined a Toastmasters club.
that's amazing
Yeah, and then
group, man.
yeah, and then like a lot of the stuff I realized that, like you said, you are always selling. You have to understand the psyche. You have to find out who the
Yeah,
detractor is in a meeting, what they want really, how can you satisfy their need. So
yeah.
yeah, this stuff is really useful. But hopefully now you guys can comment. Like you guys are younger who are watching. A lot of my viewers are from India. Maybe things change now
I'm and even if it's not available, I mean,
online. Yeah.
it's yeah, I mean, it's not. Yeah, there's never been a better time in the history of the planet and us on it where this much education is available for
For
free.
free. Yes. Yeah.
And so, you know, there's no one gatekeeping saying, you know, Raj, you're never allowed to learn how to do storytelling.
Right.
No one's saying that, right? So I mean, watch some YouTube videos. You'll learn the same things I learned in the comms
Exactly.
class.
So Nirmal,
So
so why are you not in Amsterdam? If I didn't know, actually, I didn't know you were half Dutch. Amsterdam people seem to having fun. I have been there 3 times, and people are always having a good time. My friend is working in Amsterdam. Actually, he is in cloud as well. He lives close to like the Amsterdam station, and he's like,
that's
dude, this,
awesome.
yeah, like their work-life balance is really cool. I'm like, wow, okay.
Hey, never say never. You
Never
know, I never said that that wasn't my plan at some point in the future, right?
Okay, okay.
I mean, the reason I'm here is because, you know, my mom is here, and she's getting older, and
Mhm,
you have to be close to family, and family is important. So
mhm.
never say never about all those other things. And you know, maybe me and you, we can meet up in Amsterdam one day.
Definitely, yeah. I mean, I'm glad that you decided to stay here because then we get to meet, right, in AWS.
Yeah,
And now,
yeah. Save some pizza and bagels for me,
that's
Raj.
right,
Don't
that's
eat it
right.
all.
Um, okay, so Nirmal, any parting advice to the viewers on achieving their dream job or dream career?
Oh, all kinds of stuff. promise me this, Raj, you'll have me on and we'll dig into this topic even
We
more.
will.
But
We will. Yeah.
so I would say lead with empathy, right? But Nirmal, I'm not a leader. I'm not a manager. No, everyone's a leader.
Right.
If that is career progression. Learning how to lead and becoming a leader is career progression. And it is the thing that, most companies are looking for. There's a reason that Amazon calls those principles leadership principles, right? They're not called like how to have a career principle, right? Or something else like
get more money principle,
Yeah, exactly. But lead with empathy, and it could be leading yourself, right? Like be empathetic to yourself, and also, but empathy is an important thing. Learn more about it, learn how to cultivate it, become an active listener. I did this exercise with a group of people recently where we did an active listening exercise. You find a friend of yours or a colleague, you sit face to face, just like we would be doing if we were in person.
Right.
And one person gets 2 minutes to tell a story, any kind of story they want to, real or fiction, whatever. And the other person cannot interrupt them. They have to keep active engagement, like non-verbal active engagement. And they have to do that for 2 minutes. And you'll realize how hard it is to concentrate on someone else speaking for 2 minutes without you starting to think about what you want to say in response to them. And so this is an activity to work on actually listening and not trying to formulate a response really quickly. Does that make sense?
Yep.
Which is a natural thing we want to do. Strong beliefs loosely held. So strong beliefs loosely held. I do another talk about this. You could probably find it online somewhere. Strong beliefs means don't be afraid to have an opinion, but if you do have an opinion, be open to changing it with either new information or being okay saying you were wrong. So I think having strong beliefs is good. I think that's a natural place, and it's a good thing to be able to provide data and analysis to back whatever your opinions are. But you should also be open to changing that if you've got new information or someone makes a better argument, or there is no perfect thing, and you just have to disagree and commit. The third thing I'd like to mention, and this is something that you can watch a lot of TED Talks and other advice places, and no one will ever say this stuff, but luck plays a massive role. It actually plays a much bigger role than anyone really wants to admit in terms of success. And I'm going to tell you right now, luck played probably the majority of the role in terms of my own success and where I am today. And unfortunately, that's essentially useless to you. So I'm with the fear of me saying stuff that says basically don't take the advice I'm just giving you in these past sentences. Do not ignore the role that luck plays. That being said, find those opportunities, right? Increase the surface area, and maybe you can increase your luck a little bit. Or at a minimum, don't dismiss people. You never know where those people are going to end up back in your life and what they're going to turn into. Obviously, if someone's harming you, please remove them from your life. But outside of that, like I'm going to be nice to Raj because I don't know when Raj is going to be my customer, my CEO, my CTO, whatever, right? My best friend. Don't know. And lastly, I would say is keep watching Raj in the cloud.
Whoa, money advice right there, Nirmal. You did the job for me. Excellent. So, Nirmal, how can people get more of Nirmal? Like, how can people reach you? How can they contact you?
Yeah, I'm working on strengthening my personal online presence, but I'm at Normal Faults, and Raj, I'm sure you'll put this on down here somewhere or up there somewhere. But I'm at Normal Faults pretty much everywhere online. You can follow me on Twitter, and you can also follow me on LinkedIn. I do post posts from other AWSers or Amazonians and AWS articles and topics that are interests of me to me. I try to post about things that are relevant. So just follow me on LinkedIn. and normal faults online. And be on the lookout for more content from me at some in some kind of venue or channel in the future.
Excellent. Thank you, Nirmal. Well, Nirmal, these have been very deep and thought-provoking conversations, very different from my other conversations, because we not only contained ourselves in technology, but we actually explored the human mindset and what other things folks need to think about when they think about life, career, and dream job. So thank you again for taking the time to come to my channel. And I'm sure viewers, let me know what other questions you have for Nirmal for the next part. I'm gonna make a Lord of the Rings trilogy with Nirmal series.
Hopefully, yeah. Well,
Yes,
thank you
yes.
so much for having me, Raj. This was an absolutely great conversation, and can't wait to be back.
Excellent. Thank you.